What happens when keeping a country alive may one day require more than protecting the land beneath it. In Tuvalu, that question begins in a place that still feels unmistakably alive. At sunset, an international runway can become a playground. Children cross the tarmac, families gather nearby, and homes, churches and roads sit on narrow coral land with the Pacific never far away. Nothing here feels like a country that has stopped living, and that is what makes the future so difficult. If life here becomes harder, can Tuvalu protect home while also creating ways for life to continue beyond it? To understand that, we first have to see how Tuvalu makes life work today. If stories like this help you see places beyond the headlines, consider subscribing and becoming part of this journey with us. Now, let's begin with the geography that shapes life in Tuvalu. To understand how life works in Tuvalu, don't begin with the ocean around it. Begin with the amount of land the country has to work with. Tuvalu is made up of 9 islands, 6 atolls, and 3 reef islands. Put all of its land together, and the total is only about 26 square kilometers. Then there is height. Across the country, the average elevation is roughly 2 meters above sea level. The highest point, on New Lakita, reaches only about 4.6 meters. Those numbers sound like geography. In practice, they become decisions. Housing needs room. Transport needs room. Public infrastructure needs room. So does recreation. And when the entire country has so little land, those needs cannot simply keep spreading away from one another. That is the part a map can hide. A map can tell you where the islands are and how much land they contain. It cannot show how many different needs have to fit into that land at the same time. A small shape on a map still has to carry all the ordinary functions of life. People need places to live and move. Communities need public space. A country needs infrastructure. The challenge is not simply that Tuvalu is small. It is that all of those functions have to fit inside a very limited physical margin. In a much larger place, distance can separate those functions. Homes, transport infrastructure, and recreation can often occupy their own zones. Tuvalu has far less room for that kind of separation. So a piece of usable land is never just an abstract patch on a map. Its importance comes from what people need it to do. This is where 26 square kilometers stops being a statistic. It becomes a way to understand why ordinary choices about space matter so much here. And the elevation numbers add another layer. There is not only little land to work with, most of it sits very low. Together, those facts explain why geography becomes part of how daily life has to be organized. And that leads to a practical question. If housing, transport, recreation, and public life all need space, how much land can be reserved for only one job? In Tuvalu, the answer becomes visible in one of the country's most unusual shared spaces. The runway in Funafuti is more revealing when you stop looking at it only as an airport. During flight operations, it has one obvious purpose. Outside those periods, the same strip of pavement can become part of community life, a place for sport, movement, and social activity. That is not an abandoned airport. It is infrastructure being used twice. In a country with so little land, leaving a large open space, useful for only one purpose, would make everyday life harder. So the runway becomes a good example of something broader. Space has to be negotiated, shared, and reused. The important point is not that Tuvaluans developed a sense of community because land is scarce. That would be far too simple. But limited land does reinforce the need for coordination. When homes, transport, public facilities, recreation, and social life operate within the same narrow setting, not every activity can have its own separate zone. Instead, the meaning of a place can change with the hour. A surface designed for aircraft can later serve people on foot. The land does not become larger, and the runway does not stop being an airport. What changes is how the available space is used around those fixed realities. That is why the runway matters to this story. From a distance, it can look like one more symbol of Tuvalu's unusual geography. Up close, it reveals something more useful: how ordinary life can keep functioning when there is little room to separate one need from another. The value of the space is therefore not only in what it was built for, but also in what it can provide when its primary job is finished. The same ground can support national infrastructure at one moment and community life at another. Adaptation here is not always a giant engineering project. Sometimes it is timing. Sometimes it is shared access. Sometimes it is allowing one place to serve more than one role. That kind of coordination makes scarcity more manageable. Not easy, not limitless, but workable. Daily life fits partly because space does not always have to be single-purpose. But land is only one part of the problem. Space can be shared. Fresh water is different. So where does it come from? Space can be shared. Water cannot. And in Tuvalu, fresh water begins with a simple fact that changes almost everything. There are no rivers and no permanent lakes. Fresh water has to be captured from the sky. Rain falls onto roofs and other collection surfaces, then moves into storage tanks that households and communities depend on. What looks like an ordinary rain tank is therefore part of one of the most essential systems in the country. That immediately makes rainfall more than weather. It becomes supply. And it also reveals why Tuvalu's vulnerability is more complicated than a shoreline moving backward on a map. The coral ground beneath these islands is porous. Water can move through it. During very high tides, salt water can be pushed upward through that coral by hydrostatic pressure. So the problem does not always arrive as a dramatic wave crossing a road. Sometimes it rises from below. That distinction matters. A place can still look intact from above. Houses may still be standing, roads may still be usable. The outline of an island may still be visible. But if salt reaches the systems people depend on for food and fresh water, the question is no longer simply whether the land is still there. One example is pulaka. Pulaka is grown in pits, and those pits can be damaged when salt water reaches them. For families who rely on these growing areas, salinity is not an abstract measurement. It changes what can be grown in the ground itself. This is where Tuvalu becomes scientifically more complicated than the familiar image of an island slowly shrinking into the sea. Because islands are not fixed objects. Coral sediment can move, shorelines can change. Land can be lost in one place and added in another. A University of Auckland study published in 2018 examined Tuvalu's islands between 1971 and 2014 and found a net increase in land area of about 2.9%. That sounds like the opposite of the story many people expect. But more land area does not automatically mean more secure living conditions. An island can gain sediment and still face serious problems with salt, water supply, food production, or flooding. The shape of the land and the ability to live safely on that land are related, but they are not the same thing. The most dramatic question is easy to ask. Will the islands still be visible? The harder question is whether the systems that make those islands livable can keep working. A roof can still collect rain. A tank can still store it. A pulaka pit can still exist. But each of those systems depends on conditions that ordinary photographs of the coastline do not fully reveal. That is why the real pressure on Tuvalu cannot be understood only by watching the edge of the sea. Some of the most important changes happen in the relationship between water, coral, food, and the people who depend on them. And once you see that, a larger question appears. So far, we have been looking mainly at the place most outsiders see first. But Tuvalu is more than Funafuti. Across the other islands, distance changes how supplies move, how communities connect, and how adaptation has to work. To understand the country, we have to leave the runway behind. Once you move beyond Funafuti, the story of Tuvalu changes again. The problem is no longer only how much can fit into one narrow place. It is how a country made of separate islands stays connected across the ocean between them. For the outer islands, that connection depends heavily on the sea. They do not have commercial airfields linking them into a regular air network. Instead, supply ships, such as the Nivaga 3 and the Manu Folau, provide a monthly connection. That changes the meaning of distance. Beyond Funafuti, separation becomes part of everyday logistics. A community may be small in physical size, but reaching it is another matter entirely. And that means adaptation cannot look exactly the same everywhere. Niu Tau offers one simple example. There, an engineered boat channel helps improve access for boats. It is not a grand national solution. It is a local response to a very local problem: how to make movement between land and sea more workable. That matters because in an island country, access is not an abstract idea. It affects whether a community can stay connected to the wider national system. Then there is Vaitupu. On this island stands Motufoa Secondary School, a place that brings together young people from all 9 of Tuvalu's islands. That one institution reveals another side of what holds an archipelago together. A country can be physically scattered and still create places where its separate communities meet. Connection is not only about ships, channels, or physical access. It can also be maintained through shared institutions across distance. And that is why the outer islands matter to this story. They prevent us from imagining that Tuvalu has one geography and therefore one solution. Niu Tau's access problem and Vaitupu's role in bringing young people together are different examples, but both point toward the same larger idea. Tuvalu functions as a network. Some parts of that network are connected by infrastructure, some by ships, some by institutions that bring people together, despite the distance between their homes. Every part does not need the same answer, but the country depends on those connections continuing to work. And that leaves a harder question. If each new constraint requires another adjustment, how far can adaptation actually go? There is a point where adaptation stops being a clever use of what already exists and becomes an attempt to change the physical conditions themselves. Tuvalu is already doing that. On Fongafale, the Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Project has reclaimed and elevated 7.3 hectares of land, raising it above projected sea levels for 2100. That matters. It means the story is not one of a country simply watching the ocean advance and doing nothing. Land can be reclaimed and raised, creating protected space designed around a future that looks different from the past. But this is also where the question becomes harder, because adaptation does not need to fail completely before its limits begin to matter. Over roughly 3 decades, local measurements have recorded about 15 centimeters of sea level rise, and under high emissions projections, between 50 and 90% of some areas could face exposure to high tide flooding by late this century. Those are not countdown clocks. They do not tell us that Tuvalu disappears on one specific day or in one specific year. What they describe is pressure, more frequent exposure, more strain on the places where people live. More effort required to keep homes, roads, water systems, and other parts of ordinary life working under changing conditions. That is a very different kind of threat from the dramatic image of an entire country suddenly slipping beneath the ocean. A place can become harder to live in gradually, one decision at a time, one repair at a time. One family asking whether the next house should be built here, one parent thinking about where a child should study, one young adult deciding where work, security, and opportunity may be easier to find. This is where engineering reaches a boundary it was never designed to cross. A raised piece of land can create safer physical space. It cannot decide where a family should build its future. And that does not make projects like TUCAP meaningless. Quite the opposite. Physical protection can preserve options. It can protect places people deeply want to remain in. It can give communities more room to continue living where home already exists. But preserving options is different from guaranteeing an outcome. The pressure on Tuvalu is better understood as a tightening habitability squeeze. The land does not have to vanish overnight for choices to become more difficult. Flood exposure can increase. Maintaining ordinary life can demand more. And over time, the question facing a family may change from "how do we adapt here?" to something much more personal. How much of our future should still depend on being here? That is the turning point in this story. Until now, almost every constraint has produced another response. Limited land could be shared. Difficult access could be improved. Communities separated by ocean could still be connected. Even new land can be created and raised. But none of those achievements can promise that every future need will always be met in the same place. So the next stage of adaptation may not be entirely about changing the islands. It may also be about giving people choices beyond them. And that raises a question far more difficult than how high to build a seawall or how much land to reclaim. If leaving can make a family's future safer, does leaving mean abandoning Tuvalu? Or could staying and leaving become two parts of the same strategy? Once the question moves from protecting land to protecting a family's future, adaptation becomes much more personal. A seawall does not have to decide where it belongs. A family does. And for some Tuvaluans, there is now a formal path that makes that choice more real. Under the Falapili Union between Tuvalu and Australia, 280 permanent residency visas are available each year through a ballot. That number is deliberately limited. But the interest around it has been much larger. In the 2025 ballot, more than 8,700 applicants were registered, including dependents. That does not mean 8,700 people are packing their bags, and it certainly does not mean everyone in Tuvalu wants to leave. What it shows is that mobility itself has become a meaningful option. For a family thinking years ahead, an option like that can change the shape of the future. It creates the possibility that home and opportunity may no longer have to exist in exactly the same place. That is where the emotional tension begins, because leaving an island is not the same as ceasing to belong to it. A person can build part of a life somewhere else and still have parents, grandparents, relatives, memories, and obligations tied to home. A family can want greater security and still want Tuvalu to remain a place their children know. That can create a trade-off no statistic can resolve. Mobility may widen access to work, education, or long-term security. Staying can preserve daily closeness to family, community, and familiar places. The same option can therefore mean opportunity to one person and painful distance to another. Someone can leave because an opportunity exists and still hope to return, and someone else can choose to stay because being physically close to family, community, and familiar places matters more. None of those choices cancel the others. That is what makes the idea of migration so easy to misunderstand from the outside. From a distance, it can look like a simple movement from one country to another. Stay or go. Remain or abandon. But for the people making the decision, the line can be much less clean. Mobility can create distance without automatically ending connection. It can give a family another place to build part of its future while leaving open the question of what continues at home. And this is why the 280 visas matter beyond the number itself. They turn an abstract discussion about Tuvalu's future into an actual choice that some families can make. Not a compulsory exit. Not proof that the country is emptying. A choice. And choices change the meaning of adaptation. Until now, adaptation in this story has mostly meant changing how life works on the islands. Use space differently. Protect essential systems. Improve access. Raise land. Mobility introduces another possibility. Instead of adapting only the place, people can also adapt where parts of their lives are built. That does not make the physical islands less important. In some ways, it makes them more important. Because once people begin building lives across borders, the question becomes how connection to home is maintained across distance. A family can move. A person can hold on to relationships. But a country is more complicated. It has institutions, records, rights, territory, symbols, and a national identity that cannot simply fit inside one suitcase. So if more Tuvaluans eventually live beyond the islands while still seeing themselves as part of Tuvalu, the next question is larger than migration. Can the country itself remain continuous too? A family can carry photographs, documents, memories, and relationships across a border. A country has to carry much more. It needs records. It needs institutions. It needs legal continuity. And Tuvalu has begun preparing for that possibility in very concrete ways. One of them is the Future Now project. Part of that effort involves creating 3D LiDAR scans and digital cultural archives, records designed to preserve information about places, objects and parts of Tuvalu's cultural world in digital form. A digital archive is not a homeland, but it can preserve information that might otherwise become harder to access, document, or pass on. If more Tuvaluans eventually live outside the islands, continuity is therefore not only about memory, it is also about whether the records and institutions connecting them to the country continue to exist. Tuvalu has also taken a legal step in that direction. In 2023, a constitutional amendment enshrined the idea that Tuvalu's statehood is permanent, and that its roughly 900,000 square kilometer exclusive economic zone remains part of that continuity even if land becomes inundated. That is a powerful statement of Tuvalu's position. But it is not the same as saying every question of international recognition has already been settled. Then there is another, much more familiar piece of that institutional story hiding in plain sight on the internet. The letters .tv, Tuvalu's country code internet domain, has generated millions in annual licensing revenue, representing a meaningful part of government income. The domain also helped fund the fee associated with Tuvalu joining the United Nations in 2000. These are very different tools: a digital archive, constitutional language, and an internet domain. But together, they reveal the same possibility. Some parts of a country's continuity can extend far beyond its physical land. There is also a limit. Digital scans can preserve records. Law can assert continuity. A domain name can generate revenue. None of them can recreate the experience of growing up among relatives, speaking a language face to face, gathering in familiar places, or knowing where family histories are rooted. Institutions can travel farther than land. Lived culture survives differently. It depends on people continuing to practice it, teach it, and recognize one another through it. And that brings the story to its final question. If Tuvaluan people become more geographically dispersed, is there any evidence that identity can remain strong after a community moves away from its original island? For that, we do not need to look into the future. We can look into Tuvalu's past. There is already a Tuvaluan story about what happens when a community carries part of itself across the ocean. It begins with Vaitupu. In 1946, people from the Vaitupu community purchased Kioa Island in Fiji. Settlement began the following year. The circumstances were different from the climate pressures Tuvalu faces today, so Kioa should not be treated as a prediction of what future relocation would look like. But it gives us something more useful than a prediction. It gives us evidence that movement does not automatically erase identity. On Kioa, Tuvaluan language, fatele dances, and a distinct sense of Tuvaluan identity have continued within the community. The people moved. The culture did not simply disappear behind them. And that matters because it changes the final question. For most of this story, survival has looked physical. Make limited land work, protect the systems that make life possible, keep islands connected, raise land where possible, create options when the future becomes harder to predict. But Kioa shows that continuity also depends on things that cannot be measured in hectares. Language has to be spoken. Traditions have to be practiced. Children have to learn what connects them to the people who came before them. Relationships have to survive distance. A community has to keep recognizing itself. None of that means relocation is easy. And Kioa cannot tell us that moving a much larger number of people in a future shaped by climate pressure would produce the same result. A historical example is not a guarantee. Its value is narrower and more human. It shows that physical movement and cultural disappearance are not automatically the same event. That is why Tuvalu's future cannot be reduced to a map of where the shoreline may be decades from now. A country is land, but it is also people living in relationship with that land and with one another. If those relationships stretch across borders, continuity becomes harder, but not automatically impossible. Protecting the islands still matters. The physical homeland still matters. The places where families live, where histories are rooted, and where community life continues, cannot simply be replaced by a document, a digital archive, or a new address overseas. But creating ways for people to build parts of their future elsewhere does not have to mean giving up on that homeland either. The difficult part is keeping those two goals connected, sustaining life where home already exists, while making sure distance does not sever the language, relationships, and institutions that make that home meaningful. That is the stay and leave paradox. Tuvalu's answer is not one seawall, one migration pathway, or one digital project. And it is not the idea that physical land no longer matters. Continuity comes from keeping the pieces connected, the islands, the people who stay, the people who leave, the language they carry, and the institutions that link them. Wherever Tuvaluans build parts of their future, Tuvalu is still something they belong to together. That is what has to survive.